This session is structured around an article published in the British Journal of Management, co-authored with Emma Parry, Chris Brewster and Michael Morley, where we focus on balancing rigour and relevance and make the case for methodological pragmatism in conducting large-scale, multi-country comparative management studies. The article can be downloaded via the link shared there. Essentially, what we argue is for methodological pragmatism. Now, what does that mean? Well, we'll start with why do comparative research in the first place? Ultimately, it allows a broader set of voices to be heard. So in other words, we're not just looking in one little corner somewhere, what's going on. We're comparing experiences or practices across different locations, potentially around the world. And allowing all these voices to be heard gives us greater insight into the phenomenon that we're exploring. But in the process of increasing that set of voices, of course, we end up increasing the level of complexity of the research that we're looking at. So why bother to do this? Well, ultimately, we're trying to make a contribution. And ways in which we can make a contribution are by tapping into that complexity. So specifically, what value do institutional and cultural contexts add? Well, they are mechanisms for theorizing and therefore demonstrating contribution. And I'll get back to this point in a moment, just explaining how context actually helps us to develop theory. So then how can I conduct multi-country data collection? Well, I'm going to argue that as an individual, you're probably not going to do that. You are probably going to need to collaborate with other people. Multi-country data collection is a very sensitive, it's very, very sensitive to context. So the more people that understand in depth the context in which you're trying to collect the data, the better the end result. So we'll talk about that collaboration piece as well. And so then generally, what challenges will I face if I'm conducting this comparative research? Well, the core challenge, I argue, is that you're going to be balancing rigor and generalizability, the best practice approach as such to conducting research, with legitimacy and relevance. So what is relevant in different contexts? What is legitimate in different contexts? Is that the same as is being demanded by the best practices in methodology? So we'll explore some of these questions as we go forward. So back to the C word, contribution, or the C word, context. How can context help us to make a contribution in our research when we're publishing? Well, Wetton described two ways in which context can help us with theory development. The first way is called theories in context, or also described as the etic approach. Now, theories in context test existing theories in different cultural contexts by discovering moderating variables or boundary conditions that refine or extend these existing theories. So in other words, the theory that already exists, we start to understand better how it can be applied when we look at it in lots of different contexts. So an example I'm sharing with you here is some other work that I was involved with Paul Lidhart, Eric Poutzman, and Chris Brewster, where we explored the effects of market economy type and foreign multinational enterprise subsidiaries on the convergence and divergence of human resource management practices. This was published in the Journal of International Business Studies. So essentially here, we were taking theories around market economies and multinational firms versus domestic firms. And we were applying those theories across multiple country contexts to understand better the extent to which market economy and organization type help us to understand the convergence or divergence of HRM practice use. So in that way, we were able essentially to identify the boundary conditions of existing theory. In contrast, theories of context, or the EMIC approach, they use context as a source for novel theorizing. So most of us in our lifetime are not going to develop a theory of context. These are few and far between, have a huge impact when they are developed, but we don't develop them every day. We're more likely to be working on testing existing theories in different contexts, rather than actually developing a theory of context. So a couple of examples here of theories of context are neo-institutional theory, co-evolution theory, resource dependence theory. They are all theories that explore how, for example, an organization within a certain environment, within its own settings, how those external environment of the organization, how that affects what happens inside the organization. So those are theories of context. That's how we can make our contribution, either through developing theories in context or developing theories of context. So now we've kind of decided, okay, we want to make a contribution to this field. And let's say we've decided to go the empirical route, and we are going to test existing theory in different contexts to try to expand and clarify that theory. So if we're going to embark on multi-country data collection, then the first thing that we need to start to think about is the different levels of analysis that get involved here. So just talking about different theories there. So what level is the theory based at? So if we talk about neo-institutional theory, for example, this is about institutions within nation states, for example, that affect the way that organizations work. So our level of theory is at that national institutional level. And we're looking at how that affects organizations within within those national boundaries, within that country. So we have to make sure that there's an appropriate level of analysis that matches the level of observations to the level of theory. So are we looking at country level? Are we looking at organization level? Are we looking at team level? Are we looking at individual level? Are we looking at individuals nested within teams, within organizations, within countries? If we're doing that, then we're getting into very, very complex research. But just make sure we don't want to use an individual level theory, for example, to explain and to gather data at a national level, and then to try somehow to match an individual theory to national level observations. The theory and the observations must be at the same level of analysis. The second point here is when we're thinking about how we're actually going to then measure this. So we need to be sure that we're making the measurement at that correct level of analysis. So, for example, cross-cultural studies. There's a lot of debate within cross-cultural management as to whether we can measure culture at a national level or at an individual level or both. But basically, if we're using national culture, then that is a collective attribute of a nation. It's not a particular individual. We know there's a lot of variation on individual level values within an overall national culture. So if we're going to start aggregating up from individual level to national level, we need to be able to establish agreement there before we're able to make that aggregation. And ultimately, the more that we try to mix these levels, so have these cross-level effects, the more complex we're going to get. So if we're trying to look at how national culture affects individual attitudes, we're looking at cross-level effects here, which become more complex to manage as we move forward with, collecting the correct data, but then also analyzing that data. So keep it as simple as you can. Focus on the appropriate level of analysis to answer your research question, to make your contribution. The next issue here is about sampling then. So we've decided where we want to make our contribution. We'll know the level of analysis that we're going for, but who are going to be the respondents to our survey? Who are we going to interview? How are we going to get to the right people? So appropriate sampling across people or organizations, depending on our level of analysis, within a country or a specific culture, we have to think about that appropriate sampling to be able to extrapolate to the higher level to make cross-national comparisons. If we're aiming to compare one country with another country, we need to make sure that we're sampling at the right level to be able to make that comparison. And one of the first challenges that we come up against is whether we're able to develop probability or non-probability samples. So best practice research would tell us that probability samples are essential. And a probability sample is a sample that has, that basically, if we look at organizations within a country, a probability sample would be every single organization in that country has exactly the same probability of ending up in our study. A non-probability sample has bias, whereby across that whole country, there will be a number of organizations that never stood a chance of getting into our study for whatever reason. So then we've got bias in terms of representativeness. Now, so we say, okay, we need to have a probability sample so that every organization has the same chance of getting into our study. But it depends on a country that we're studying as to whether this is actually possible for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is the difficulty of defining the population. Is there a publicly available database of organizations in that country? In some countries, yes. Generally, smaller countries have like a Chamber of Commerce that lists all of the organizations in that country. And therefore, you can take that list and contact every single one of those organizations, giving all of them the same probability of ending up in your study. In large countries in particular, and in other countries that just don't have those databases, we don't know, we can't actually get a list and therefore make sure that we're reaching out to everybody. So there's going to be bias in the selection of organizations that we're reaching out to. Also, if you take the US for example, where I'm based, I think it would take more than a lifetime to actually reach out to every organization in the country. So we have to make choices in that process. The other piece to think about in terms of population is how this then affects response rates. And in a country where there's a small country with a small number of organizations, we might have pretty strong relationships with a number of those organizations and ultimately can get quite a high response rate. But when we're getting data from a very large country with many different organizations, the chances are the response rate is going to be really small relative to that smaller country. So then we end up with one country with a response rate of 66% and another country with a response rate of 3% in the same study. How can we justify that? This will happen by the nature of the different sizes of countries. Equally, if you're collecting data at multiple points in time, that response rate is going to vary each time you do the study and vary between each country as well. So how do we deal with some of these, how do we deal with some of these problems? What are some of the remedies? So one way is you want, as far as possible, to demonstrate sample representativeness. And the best way of doing that, if you don't have a population list, is to compare the sample that you have with key known population characteristics. So, for example, if 30% of organizations in a particular country are from the public sector, then roughly 30% of your data should also be from the public sector if you're aiming for representativeness between public and private sector. Similarly, you might be able to get figures around organization size or turnover or age of organizations, these different characteristics that you can demonstrate that your sample represents the national average figures as best as possible. When it comes to response rates, the issue then is basically explain what's going on. You're not going to get the same response rate from 2 different countries, from 3 different countries. By the time you've got 15 different countries in your study, you're not going to have the same response rates. So if you have got large countries with very low response rates, explain why that's happening. Explain in your study why there is there's no population database, or why there's a really high response rate somewhere because you've got excellent access to the full list of organizations, for example. So transparency is key here. Don't hide that things were difficult. Explain why things ended up the way that they did. The next piece then, when we've actually selected our sample, is to think about how are we going to collect equivalent data across the different countries. Now, there's a lot of literature out there explaining about how we can achieve equivalence and also testing for bias when we're doing analyses. But I'm going to focus here still on the data collection end of things. So what we really want to achieve here is to make sure that we're measuring the same thing in the same across all the different locations. So now we're talking about the importance of construct, functional, and metric equivalence. So construct equivalence is basically, are we measuring the same thing in the different locations? So take a construct like engagement, employee engagement. Can we capture employee engagement in different locations? Functional equivalence is, does it actually mean the same thing? So if I'm talking about employee engagement in the US, and somebody's talking about employee engagement in Japan, are we actually talking about the same thing? And then when we come to metric equivalence, then we're talking about, are we measuring employee engagement in the same way in those different contexts? We want to make sure that we're capturing the construct in the same way in the different contexts. Now, then there is a question, is construct equivalence necessary or even desirable? If we go to best practice, we would say that yes, construct equivalence is necessary because we want to make sure we're measuring the same thing. There's no point in having studied apples in the USA and bananas in Japan. We don't know, there's nothing to compare at the end of the day then, because we've measured and explored different things. So construct equivalence is necessary at a certain level. There's no point in asking people questions about things that are irrelevant in their context. For example, if we were to do a survey about something that was mandated by law in one country and was not mandated by law in another country. So we ask, do you do this practice? And all the people in the country where it is mandated go, well, yeah, of course we do this practice. That's a bit of a stupid question. And actually, I probably won't bother answering that question because, yeah, everybody does it. Whereas it's a very relevant in another context where that practice just, it isn't mandated and some people will do it and some people won't. But the reason why we might ask that question in both countries, in both contexts, might be if we're trying to measure deviance from a mandated practice or something like that. So it always depends on what your research question is. But essentially, you just need to make sure that the questions that you're asking make sense in the different contexts. There's no point in asking questions just because it's really important to you that you have that same variable if that variable means nothing to people in this other context. Now, that sense of meaning comes through the process of language translation as well. So when we're translating our questionnaires, first reaction might be, well, let's leave it in English because the business language across all the different organizations, across the different countries is English. So let's just do the whole thing in English. There's quite a bit of research that demonstrates that there is bias in non-native language responses. So people who do not have English as a native language, even though they can read the questionnaire, they're still going to interpret things a little differently from what you might have intended in developing the questionnaire in the first place. So it is always best to translate to native language wherever possible. Another technique to ensure that you're not building bias into your measurement tools is, wherever possible, focus on gathering facts rather than feelings. So if you ask a question like, how many people are employed in your organization? That's really easy for anybody in any country to answer. If you ask a question about, to what extent were you feeling engaged when you started work this morning? Then you're starting to get into this sense of feelings, and I might interpret it one way, someone else might interpret what that engagement is in another way. In a different country, the chance of that, the different interpretation increases greatly. So we're suddenly getting into a lot of potential noise in our data. So stick to facts wherever you can, if that answers your research question. Keep saying that, because it depends what research you're wanting to conduct as to what is the most appropriate way of doing this. Ultimately, there are very good back translation techniques for ensuring that language translation happens correctly, and making sure that you are measuring the same thing in different countries to the extent that you want it to be the same, to be able to make the comparisons in your study. The bottom line here is that you need to collaborate with people who are local in each country where you're collecting data. If you collaborate with local research partners, they can help with those difficult conversations around what does engagement mean, because I can't predict what it means in another country, but the person in that country, you can have an in-depth conversation with them in order to really understand what engagement means, for example. By having those local collaborators, you also increase the chances of getting access to people to respond to your survey as well. So conducting a multi-country study as an individual is extremely difficult and potentially inappropriate. By collaborating with local research partners, then you start to be able to tap into those local contexts much more effectively. So having set up our tool, we've got our sample, we've got our research tool for collecting the data. How do we actually then go about collecting the data? We raise questions here around consistency versus appropriateness. And I'm talking here about consistency of procedures. So in other words, if we're collecting data via an online survey here in the US, do we have to collect data via an online survey in the other 20 countries that we want to collect data from? If we can, and if it's appropriate, then great. Yeah, you don't have a problem in having to justify why you took a different approach in a different country. But there are examples of studies out there published that make it very explicit that in one context, in the UK, we had to collect data via an online system because that's what people expected. In China, we had to do it via telephone because that was a better way of ensuring the integrity of the data that we were collecting. So the appropriate way is to have two different collection techniques for the same within one study. That doesn't sound like best practice. Best practice will push you towards consistency, but if it's not appropriate, then it's still not going to give you good results. So the appropriateness of the data collection method in each country is most important. And then again, be transparent. When you report the procedures in your paper, be transparent. Say, it wasn't consistent, we did it differently, and this is why we did it differently. That way people will understand what's going on within the study. The next issue here is about whether we should collect panel data or trend data when we're actually trying to see how things are changing over time. So if we're doing something multi-country and at multiple points in time, does it make sense to track the same organizations each time we collect data when the external, the economic, the technological context is changing? So in other words, if we start the study in year 1 and we go to the same group of high-tech industry organizations, and then in year 3, we go back and go to the same group of high-tech organizations. And in year 6, we do the same. And in year 9, we do the same again. So now there's 8 years difference between our first lot of data collection and our final lot of data collection. We've tracked the same companies over time. So that would be panel data. If our research question is about how these particular organizations have changed over time, then that's a good design. If our research question is about how organizations are operating in the context, at this changing context, then the organizations we're sampling in year 9 might not actually even still be representative of the high-tech sector by then. High-tech sector moves very, very quickly. So in that 9-year period, we may have missed out on all these new entrants into the high-tech sector. And we're just kind of gathering data from this old group of high-tech companies, which may not be that relevant anymore. We need these newer companies in. So in other words, and that would be, if we choose to collect data from different organizations each time, then we're moving with the context. You know, the new organizations that are coming in, we're picking those up. Some of the old ones that have gone, we've lost those. So our sample at each point in time is very relevant to that current point in time in terms of economic and technological development. So then that becomes answering a different research question. That's trend data, which is different to panel data, where we look just at what happened to those specific organizations. So again, think about what your research question is as to the best approach. And the final piece on this then is, can you collect all the data in all the countries at the same time? And no matter how hard you try, the answer will still probably be no, you cannot. The best plans, we want to run with this survey, right? We're all going to press the button on the 1st of July, that's it, we're all collecting the data. I can guarantee you that will never happen if you've got a lot of countries involved. 2 or 3 countries, yep, hopefully you can do that. More than that, something will come up. Somebody couldn't manage to run it at exactly the same time. Various economic changes happen. There's a new election, a new government comes in place, and suddenly all companies are just so busy making changes that they have to make, they haven't got time for surveys. We're going to have to delay it 6 months, a year. You know, these things happen. It shouldn't make you not want to do the multi-country studies. But again, you just need to be able to track when data was collected and make sure that you justify any differences in timing as you're collecting that data. Because again, best practice would say everyone presses the button at the same time and we all collect the data exactly the same time. The realities of involving working with different people in different countries with these different contexts, managing to collect all that data at the same point in time is really, really tricky. So what does methodological pragmatism actually look like then? We argue in the paper that this is less about rigor and more about relevance. So yeah, rigor is important. Always start with understanding what is the most rigorous approach for conducting an empirical study. What is the best practice? What should we be trying to achieve? And if we can match our study with that, then great. We don't have to do justifications along the way. It's kind of accepted. But multi-country studies, comparative management studies, are difficult. They are tricky to do. And sometimes we need to focus on the relevance a little more than the rigor, making sure that what we're actually studying is sound. So it's got the rigor, it's sound, but it's also relevant and it means something in different contexts. So hopefully I haven't put you off from actually wanting to conduct multi-country studies. But there are challenges along the way. My advice is be conscious about making decisions, know what best practice is. If you're deviating from best practice, know why you're deviating from best practice and justify that and be transparent about it. That way people understand what you've done, why you've done it, and will give you greater credibility for the choices and things that you've made along the way.